Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Megan Robertson. I'm an attorney in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare and life sciences practice based out of our Washington, D.C. office. Laboratories in the U.S. are facing a major regulatory landscape shift. As of May 6, 2024, FDA has finalized a new rule ending its historical blanket enforcement discretion over laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, as they're more commonly called, now requiring that all in vitro diagnostics, regardless of whether developed by a lab or a traditional manufacturer, are considered medical devices subject to at least some level of regulation by the agency. On today's episode of Diagnosing Health Care, my colleagues and I will walk through the basic elements of the LDT final rule and lay out the landscape over the next few years during FDA's phase out of the historical enforcement discretion. We will also touch on the existing and potential challenges to the validity of the final rule and key developments to watch for as this new regulatory era evolves. If you like what you hear today, please subscribe to the show. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare and life sciences. Brought to you by the lawyers at Epstein Becker Green.
So joining me today is James Boiani, a member of the firm based out of our Washington, D.C. office. Thanks for joining us, James.
Happy to be here, Megan.
We are also pleased to welcome Rob Wanerman, also a member of the firm and also coming to us from our Washington, D.C. office.
Hello. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. Excited to have you both here. As we know, because I know we've been following this quite closely over the last several years, the debate over the appropriate level of regulation and oversight of LDTs has been around for decades. There have been attempts by both FDA and Congress to implement some form of regulatory regime dating back to around 2014, but none have been successful. For a little bit of historical context for our listeners, FDA's traditional definition of an LDT is an in vitro diagnostic, or an IVD test, that's intended for clinical use. That is, first, designed, developed, and used within a single laboratory, and second, is made up of components that are legally marketed in the U.S. and are used in a manner that's consistent with that marketing authorization. The single laboratory that's designing, developing, and using the LDT also must be certified as a high-complexity lab under CLIA, which is the federal licensing regime for clinical labs. So, like I said, we've been following this discourse for quite a while, and I know I've been following it for my entire career, and much of what I've learned has come from James and working with James on these matters. So, James, can you talk us through why FDA has taken this step and how the LDT industry has evolved over time such that the agency has become concerned about the safety and efficacy of the traditional enforcement discretion policy?
Sure. So the roots of FDA, and this is FDA's position, the roots of FDA's authority to regulate come from the 1976 medical device amendments, which gave them explicit authority over regulation of in vitro diagnostics. And FDA's position for a long time has been that laboratory developed tests are in vitro diagnostics. So just like the tests that are manufactured in the medical device industry and sold to labs, they're saying what the labs are making are actually devices as well and subject to FDA regulation. And the enforcement discretion policy, when it came out, it ties back to these 1976 amendments when lab developed tests were simple. They were chemical tests. They were tests for iron and calcium, what you'd think of as sort of traditional chemistry methods. Over time, they became more and more sophisticated. You had introduction of PCR into labs. You had more recently, but now dating back several years, introduction of more software-based tools. You have AI coming in. You have what are sometimes referred to as dry labs or in silico labs, which are really more software-based analysis tools. And FDA's view was that when the enforcement discretion policy was created, what they had in mind were these very simple chemistry tests. And now you have something that looks a lot more like a very complex device that needs FDA review and regulation. And so that's the position that FDA is coming from, and what was the primary motivation behind the final rule. And there are other things too, just the expansion of the use of LDTs. I think when FDA was originally developing the policy, they weren't envisioning sort of a multi-billion-dollar LDT industry. They weren't envisioning tests that were making the kinds of clinical claims that are being made out there now for a lot of these tests, and really sort of branching into things like cancer diagnosis and stuff like that. They've taken many attempts over the years to try and constrain the growth of LDTs, usually by trying to impose restrictions on the manufacturers of components. But I think even they would admit they've been pretty much unsuccessful at constraining the growth. So now you've got this very large industry, very complex tests, a lot of software-based tools. I think that's what motivated them to move in this case.
Thanks, James. I think that historical context is really important to understand before we dive into the details, which we are going to do now. So there are a few key aspects of the final rule from my perspective that I think are important to cover today. Understanding, of course, that everyone should review the final rule in its entirety, and including all of the guidance that FDA has put out to date and will put out going forward. The key aspects that I want to cover today are, first, the phase-out period timeline and the milestones that companies are expected to meet. Second, the concept of an IVD offered as an LDT. And finally, the new targeted enforcement discretion policies that FDA introduced in the final rule. So starting with the phase-out period, it's critical to understand here that the rule doesn't end FDA's enforcement discretion policy over LDTs outright. It's not a hard stop. Rather, labs can continue to develop and market LDTs during the phase-out period so long as they are in compliance with the mile markers of the phase-out period. Once the phase-out period ends, though, which currently is estimated to be in 2028, all developers of tests, whether IVDs or LDTs, and whether they are manufacturers traditionally or laboratories, must be in compliance with the applicable regulatory requirements prior to marketing their tests in the US. So generally speaking, let's talk about the phases, at least at a high level. In phase 1, expecting companies to come into compliance with some basic medical device reporting requirements. Phase 2, registering your lab as an establishment and listing the test as a device with FDA, submitting labeling materials to FDA, and meeting the investigational use requirements set out by the agency. Phase 3 would require coming into compliance with all other applicable quality systems requirements, which FDA says that, subject to a few small carve-outs for LDTs, would include records requirements, design controls, CAPAs, purchasing controls, acceptance activities. And then phase 4 and 5, depending on the complexity and the risk associated with the test, would mark the requirement to submit pre-market review materials, if applicable, to the type of test that is being developed. James, putting aside the enforcement discretion policies in the final rule, which we'll get to in a minute, given that the clock is currently ticking and compliance with phase 1 is expected by May 6, 2025, what should labs and developers be focusing on over the next months or even years to come into compliance with the applicable FDA requirements as they approach?
The first thing to do is really assess the LDTs that are being used by the lab, because the requirements and timelines are going to relate to, in large part, the kinds of tests being offered. So you need to understand what you have and then map out a plan to start implementing those requirements. And some of these requirements may sound similar to current CLIA requirements, and you might be able to crosswalk what FDA is requiring to a clear provision and try and sort of update your current systems to add FDA as opposed to thinking about it as making a entirely new system. Or in some cases, depending on the lab operations, maybe you will need to add things in. But I think it's important to start mapping out what you have, coming up with sort of a overall, Gantt chart of this is what we'll need to implement, and this is sort of the timelines we'll need to meet for our lab. And then looking for resources. Those could be, if you want to do it yourself, looking to FDA guidances and documents regarding medical device reporting. I expect FDA will be putting out guidance directed at the lab community to help facilitate that. There are a lot of companies and lawyers like us that sort of advise on those types of issues in terms of how you set up these types of systems and the things to look for in trainings, et cetera. So I think you're really sort of beginning to educate yourself on what the standards are that FDA is talking about, and then looking for ways to implement that properly will be important too. And I think there are a lot of resources out there that could be helpful to that.
Yeah, definitely. And at the end of June of 2024, FDA put out a guidance document for small entities directed at the lab community, kind of directing them to resources to start to learn more about FDA's requirements and what might apply over the next couple of years. And FDA has said that they will put out more targeted webinars going forward. So definitely keep an eye out for those for sure. Their first webinar, in fact, the agency's first webinar was on some of the more targeted enforcement discretion policies that are outlined in the final rule. Before we get to those, I think it's important to understand the next topic, which is this concept of IVDs offered as LDTs. This is likely to become, if it's not already, a sort of term of art in the lab industry. In the agency's commentary and the public webinars that they've done so far, FDA has acknowledged, as James alluded to earlier, that it hasn't been entirely consistent with enforcing the single lab traditional definition of an LDT. As a result, the agency recognizes that there are certain currently marketed IVDs that are offered as LDTs available, in that they have been on the market, they don't meet the exact definition of an LDT, but they've been marketed as LDTs by labs. And again, not necessarily in bad faith, just kind of due to the lack of consistent understanding of what an LDT is over the last several years. So FDA has said that these IVDs offered as LDTs, if they were available on the market prior to FDA's issuance of the final rule, which FDA says is May 6, 2024, and as long as they are not changed significantly such that they would raise a concern from FDA about the safety and efficacy of the tests, they are exempt from pre-market review requirements of the final rule. They're still subject to other aspects of the phase-out period timeline that are set out in the final rule, like reporting, registration and listing, labeling, and other requirements. But as far as pre-market review goes, they are not expected to comply with that, unless, of course, FDA comes in and raises a concern about any individual test in particular. I'll note here that a lot of folks are referring to this piece as the grandfathering rule. And in a sense it is, in a sense it's not, in that they're not allowed to exist and operate entirely as they were beforehand. They still do have to come into compliance with certain aspects of the phase-out period in phases 1 through 3. But it is an option for IVDs offered as LDTs that are currently on the market. As for the other targeted enforcement discretion policies that FDA set out, these could come into play for any tests that are developed and introduced after May 6, 2024. So there are still options. We've linked in the notes to this episode a helpful chart that FDA has put together on its LDTs website that describes each of these new policies and what is expected for labs that fall into each respective bucket. Just as a few kind of the most popular examples, for lack of a better word, there's one policy that allows LDTs that meet FDA's traditional definition of an LDT and are approved by the New York Clinical Laboratory Evaluation Program, or CLEP, to be exempt from pre-market review requirements. A lot of folks are calling that the New York CLEP exception. Another one allows, again, traditional LDTs used for unmet needs by labs that are integrated in a healthcare system for treating patients to be exempt from certain quality system requirements and pre-market review. And then there's even another bucket that allows labs that modify a version of another manufacturer's 510(k) cleared test within the scope permitted in the final rule to be exempt from pre-market review. There are others, but those again are definitely more in the public eye as being some of the more attainable options for labs that might want to try to fall into an enforcement discretion policy category as they navigate this final rule. James, I know we talked a little bit about kind of assessing inventory, but given and thinking about how the final rule applies to these labs, but given these enforcement discretion policies, given the kind of complexities that's going to come with the exercise of assessing next steps, any additional thoughts of what labs should be thinking about, any best practices they should be keeping in mind when they're going through this analysis?
Well, I mean, in terms of best practices, having good documentation is important, particularly if you're looking at leveraging some of the enforcement discretion categories, keeping information around to show that, for example, you launched a test before May 6th, 2024, things like that. You're going to want to capture that type of information if and when some questions come from FDA in terms of whether or not you fall within a particular category. So I think just in terms of those sorts of best practice issues, that's important. I think it's kind of simple stuff, being organized and also making sure you really understand your tests. I know labs understand the tests they are running, but understanding their history and assessing them against what the sort of the standards that FDA is setting up is going to be really important as well. So you really need to educate yourself on what FDA's expectations are and measure your test against those and understand the history, because also sometimes tests evolve a lot over time. I think a third thing that I would highlight is review your advertising and promotion around tests, what you're putting out, particularly like on websites. That's where FDA looks to find out what's in the marketplace. And once you've become more familiar with the FDA requirements, looking for what I would call sort of red flag issues in terms of how you're promoting your product or test is important as well, because that's probably where a lot of inquiries will come. And as you know, Megan, we work with a lot of companies that get inquiries from FDA about regulatory status of tests, when things were launched, what's going on. And a lot of that's prompted by what they find on the internet. So I think making sure your advertising and promotion aligns with your regulatory strategy for coming into compliance is really key.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you, James. That's great. So we've gone through the final rule. And of course, as with any major regulatory landscape shift, there have been some challenges to the validity of the final rule, as James and I and our colleagues have anticipated in the leading up to the release of the final rule. We're already aware of at least one legal challenge by the American Clinical Laboratory Association, or ACLA, against the validity of the final rule. And there have certainly been rumblings in Congress about whether FDA should have continued with the legislative route as opposed to going through notice and comment rulemaking to put this new regime in place. So, Rob, based on your experience and your knowledge of the developments in the administrative law space of late, can you talk us through the possibilities of what might happen to the effectiveness of the final rule over the next year or so? And understanding that you do not have a crystal ball, of course, but based on your experience, can you walk us through that?
Sure. There are several potential scenarios that might play out over the next year to 2 years. The first, of course, is nothing happens and the regulation goes into full effect as it's written, and as Megan and James have just walked you through it. Second is, as Megan mentioned, there has been litigation filed challenging the rule. There's been some commentary by members of Congress and from the industry. So there's a possibility that the FDA might decide to delay the implementation of the final rule in response to those comments. Third possibility is, depending on how the election in November turns out, and if there's a change in administration and/or a change in Congress, there is a possibility that at some point the final rule may be modified, delayed, or even withdrawn. And that would take place through public notice and comment in the Federal Register. Next, although Congress, as of late, has not been especially productive, there is always a possibility that Congress may decide to enact legislation that alters the FDA's authority, either expressly granting them the authority to regulate LDTs or expressly removing that authority. Those are the most likely scenarios. One thing, and we can talk about the litigation in more depth, but one thing that labs and other stakeholders should be aware of is, although litigation has been filed, the complaint did not request injunctive relief during the pendency of the litigation. So that means that even though a lawsuit has been filed, it does not affect the effective date or any of the milestone dates that are in the final rule.
Yeah, which I found very interesting, Rob. By the time this podcast comes out, there could be certain developments that change that or, affect what we're talking about today. But I think what would be helpful, at least at a high level, is to just understand some of the arguments that are being made in the current litigation. I know there has been the historical debate, which is the core of a lot of folks' arguments against FDA's regulation of LDTs, which is that LDTs are considered lab services and not medical devices. So, Rob, James, I welcome both of your kind of thoughts on that, and whether it's through the litigation or other, arguments to the final rule and kind of the impact that it might have.
Well, I can give a quick summary of the key points from the complaint. It's only at the complaint stage. There have been no motions for judgment. But the allegations that ACLA and one laboratory in Texas are making break out into several related buckets. First, as you said, Megan, they're arguing that lab-developed tests are not a physical device, and so they're not regulated under the current Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. They're arguing it is a service because it requires interpretation and analysis, and a lab test is not a physical product like a splint or like an implant. They're also setting the stage for an argument that a regulation of this importance invokes a case law doctrine known as the major questions doctrine that derives from several Supreme Court cases, where the court and other lower courts have said that if an agency wants to assert its regulatory authority, it has to point to an express grant of authority from Congress. And their argument is that the current text of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act does not expressly mention lab-developed tests. That's open to interpretation, mostly because the concept of what is a major question is still a somewhat fuzzy concept, and courts have to grapple with that on a case-by-case basis. And as James mentioned before, there's an argument in the complaint that lab-developed tests are already regulated thoroughly through CLIA, although there's a flaw in that argument that CLIA regulates laboratories, lab staff, and proficiency testing. It really doesn't regulate the actual laboratory test itself. So those are the key points. They're also arguing that there are a number of statements in the preamble to the regulation that were not codified, and therefore it violates the Administrative Procedure Act. That, again, remains to be seen, and that's something that FDA has probably anticipated. But those are the general points that they've made in the complaint. Their final request for relief is a judgment and declaration by the court that the final rule is unlawful. It's outside the scope of the FDA's authority. They want the final rule vacated, and they want the court to enjoin the FDA from enforcing this or any other rule like it.
Thanks, Rob. Those who have been, like I said earlier, kind of those who have been following this tug of war, so to speak, over the last several years are, or at least should be, pretty familiar with most of the arguments that ACLA is making in the complaint. James, do you have any thoughts on this?
In the proposed rule, FDA did a pretty good job of outlining their sort of case history supporting their position. There are a lot of questions out there that need to be resolved, and they're relying on some very old cases. And as seen recently, old cases don't always stand the test of time in newer courts. You might see some decisions coming out that don't align with FDA's position. I think what would be, and this is broader than labs, what would be interesting is that a lot of FDA's regulations and enforcement is predicated on decisions that were made in the 60s and 70s. Some of the case law regarding the line between services and products relates to FDA enforcement a long time ago, related to physicians making quack devices. And the arguments there were, well, we're not making a product and putting it in interstate commerce, so you can't regulate us, FDA. Courts allowed them to assert jurisdiction over those physician practices and facilities to stop them from using those devices. If, depending on how a court reasoned, if they latched onto that point of where you're providing a service, not a product, that could have a far-reaching impact beyond labs to what can a physician make in their office. And then that gets into issues like, FDA has been doing a lot of work around regulation of stem cell therapies that are being used by physician practices. Is that going to get latched onto by that industry to say, well, you can't regulate us because we're just using these products for as a service we're providing? Again, there's a lot of nuance here, but I guess my point is that FDA is relying on a lot of old cases, and if those ultimately get disrupted, it could have a far-reaching impact well beyond labs. So that's, as someone that's done this for a while, I'm very interested to see where courts would go with that.
So just to sort of bring this all to a point. So Rob, given the uncertainty of the litigation and other challenges that might be out there to the final rule, how should labs move forward, especially when, in theory, the first phase-out biomarker could get pushed back beyond that May 6, 2025 timeline?
Obviously, all labs are not alike, but in this space, there are a lot of labs that are smaller organizations. They may only have one test. And many of those organizations have to make plans months in advance. And in addition, if they are privately funded, they have to make decisions and they have to engage in their third, fourth, fifth round of fundraising. And their investors really have to know what the horizon looks like. So for now, since there's no interim relief that was requested in the litigation, those labs have to proceed along the timeline in the final rule as it's currently written. You have to watch this space to see what happens, whether FDA acts, Congress acts, or a court acts promptly. But for now, on June 26th, you still have to act as if the final rule is in effect.
And thank you for mentioning investors, because that ties in nicely to my question for James. We said what labs should be doing and the need for labs to do an assessment of inventory, document their analysis for where they fit in the final rule. You and I work with investors in the life sciences quite often. From an investor's perspective, what should investors be thinking about and watching for as this develops?
I would say from an investor standpoint, this could be a huge opportunity. We've seen this in the past in other industries. Several years ago, Congress had passed something called the Food Safety Modernization Act. And what you saw were a lot of consolidations coming out of that, a lot of purchasing opportunities, because smaller entities didn't want to address coming into compliance with those new requirements. And so there were buying opportunities, and you saw a lot of investment going into that space as smaller entities were exiting. And I think you could see similar opportunities here, where someone with the resources to invest to come into compliance with FDA requirements could potentially consolidate several smaller operating entities and make sort of a mini lab industry with maybe a network of several labs. So I think there are opportunities there. I think also when looking at potential investments, it's important for investors to understand the enforcement discretion requirements. And what you could see are investors looking for, and they should look for, whether or not tests are under enforcement discretion. And so that May 6, 2024 timeline that FDA has created, saying tests before then are under that, quote unquote grandfather clause. That's creating assets right there where you might have tests that are exempt from pre-market review requirements because of that. So I think in evaluating whether or not to get into the lab industry, understanding those timelines and looking potentially at value there could be important. I think also could be a huge opportunity in terms of the services associated with labs and also product suppliers to labs. If you looked at the comments that ACLA had submitted, this might come up in their litigation documents too, they're talking about billions of dollars a year in compliance. And that's not billions of dollars that labs just kind of throw in a pile and burn. That's billions of dollars getting transferred to individuals and entities to address compliance matters. So if you're talking about, and this is probably a significant underestimate, 10,000 labs that need to come into compliance because they've all of a sudden become device manufacturers. That could be 10,000 labs that need help setting up MDR systems for reporting, for developing quality systems. There are companies out there that do that right now in the medical device industry generally, but having a lab-specific offering to those groups could be a significant investment opportunity. And similarly, for the products being offered in the past, for FDA, there's been a clear dividing line between manufacturers of products being able to assist labs in validation of tests. Once enforcement discretion goes away, there's no basis for that division anymore. So you could have opportunities for manufacturers of components to go and assist labs in validation with the understanding that they'll eventually get their 510(k) clearance or whatever. So that's another, if you're looking at it from an investment angle, understanding that the paradigm's changing and there could be other ways to get to customers, assist them in test development in ways that you couldn't before. There could be value there. So, there are lots of opportunities that these sorts of, I'm not saying it's a pejorative, but sort of disruptive regulations can have where you're changing the landscape and understanding all the opportunities in the landscape and understanding that there's going to be a lot of compliance costs here. There are ways to capture that.
Thank you. Thanks, James. And thanks, Rob. And I know that the three of us could probably talk about LDTs for hours on end, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. Thank you both so much for participating in today's discussion on the LDT final rule. And thank you to all of our listeners. Again, I'm your host, Megan Robertson. If you like what you've heard today, please don't forget to subscribe. Diagnosing Health Care is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Health Care. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare and life sciences, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. This podcast is presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.